One Christmas, this is my second house we'd moved into. One Christmas, my dad shows up with a paper sack, and he says, I found these in my shop. I thought you could get some use out of them. And it was this old Stanley number 4.5 and this number 78 rabbiting plane. And I remember looking at them going, what am I supposed to do with those? And so I just kind of set it aside, but then I got to thinking, you know what, I'm going to figure out how to get these things to work. So I spent a lot of time online and looking at books and researching how to tear the thing apart, how to tune it, how to sharpen it. And when I took my first shavings, it changed my woodworking forever. And I want to try to get that point across to you tonight. If you're not familiar with hand planes, if you don't use them, there's a really good reason why you should have them in the shop. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to get right into it, but I always ask this question, how many of you have hand planes? Good percentage. How many of you actually use them on a regular basis? That's pretty typical. So my job tonight is to try to sway you into pulling those hand planes out, tuning them up, and getting them ready to go and using them in your projects. Why do we use hand planes at all? Well, in my opinion, there's no better tool for surfacing a workpiece. It slices the grain, it leaves a glass smooth finish. If you use any sandpaper at all, I don't care what grit you use, you're essentially tearing the wood fibers as you sand. So I like to use a hand plane on almost every workpiece before I assemble a project, just to get everything smooth, glass smooth. Now that's not to say I won't come back later after the project's assembled and do some sanding, but I like that initial surface that I get. But more importantly to me is there's no more accurate tool in the workshop for fine-tuning joinery and the fit of a joint. What other tool do you have in the shop? Can you take off 1/1000th of an inch or 2/1000ths of an inch at a time until that joint, you eliminate all the gaps in the joinery? If you want the best results, learn how to use a hand plane. Now tonight we're going to focus on bench planes, which includes a smoothing plane, jack plane, and joiner planes. Now, like I said, my dad gave me this number 4.5. This is pretty typical for a smoothing plane. I've also got a number 4 up here. This happens to be a Veritas plane you can purchase from Lee Valley. 4.5 and a 4. Just a little bit wider blade on the 4.5. So the numbering convention goes from a number 1, this little guy. Some people speculate that this used to be this was a salesman sample when the salesman used to go around to sell these to the hardware stores. They set this out as a representative sample. This one's made by Wood River Woodcraft. You can get these at Woodcraft. I got it just because I wanted to see if I'd actually use it, and surprisingly, I do. It's a little awkward to hold, but I like it. It's kind of a mini block plane to me. I've got a knob up here and a tote in the back that gives me a lot of control. So I'll use it to put a chamfer on the edge of a workpiece. Lots of little uses like that. Create a little round over. So that's a number 1. Now, if you find one of these that's a Stanley, that's less than your mortgage payment, buy it. So then they go to a number 2 size, which is, I don't own one. They're almost as rare as a number 1. The number 3 is the next step up. Then you go to the number 4. So you can see the number 3 and 4 are almost the same length, but the number 3 is a little bit narrower than the number 4. Again, these are all smoothing planes. And then you go up to the 4.5, and then you have a number 5, which I didn't bring tonight, and then a 5 1/4 is an odd number. The 5 1/4s were primarily sold to crafts or trade schools for woodworking. They would give these to the students to use. It could be considered a jack plane, jack of all trades. It makes a good smoother, it makes a good joiner, it can rough out a workpiece. Just a good all-around size to have, so these were called jack planes. This is number 5 1/4. So most of the traditional hand planes, bench planes, are what we call bevel-down. And what do I mean by bevel-down? If you take the iron and the chip breaker out, the blade resides with the bevel facing downwards. A lot of times when you buy or see a plane at an auction or an antique shop or a yard sale and you know it's reasonably priced, you take it home and you pop the lever cap off, chances are the blade's been put in upside down. So that's the first thing you look for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to look for if you're going to purchase an antique or a used hand plane. The first thing is you're going to look at the sole, you're going to look at the bottom, and you're going to see if it's relatively flat. A lot of these old smoothers have been hollowed out in the middle because why? A lot of the carpenters used them for trimming doors in your homes when they hung doors. So these, sometimes the middle's a little bit hollow. It's not a deal breaker. Sometimes you can get them flat, but it's just one thing to be mindful of. The second thing is this front portion of the mouth has to be sharp and square. If there are any nicks in this mouth at this point up here, it's probably not going to do a good job for you. The function of that is as you're planing, it supports the wood fibers and then it lets the blade pick up the shaving, and if there are nicks in here, it can't break that shaving off very cleanly, and it's going to cause some problems. Yes, sir?
Are you pointing in front of the cutting edge?
I'm pointing in front of the cutting edge, correct. Now, since we're talking about the sole, so how do you flatten it? For me, I take some self-adhesive rolls of sandpaper, maybe starting with 80 grit, put it down on my table saw, you know, a couple feet, and I just start working it back and forth, and I check the scratch pattern until I see an even scratch pattern all the way across. In particular, these 3 areas. Then I'll maybe bump up to 100 grit and maybe finish off with 120 grit. Doesn't need to be polished. So you're looking for a good solid body with no cracks. If it's been cracked, that means it's been dropped, and chances are you're never going to get it to perform as well as a complete plane. Even if it's been brazed, repaired, I just consider those donors for parts.
Or decorations.
Or decorations, yes. All right, so the next thing you're going to want to make sure is to look at the frog. And generally, I will take the frog out and make sure that the surface of the frog where the blade beds is flat. Sometimes you'll have little ridges or something on there where it's been dinged up a little bit. So I'll take a file, or sometimes I'll take a piece of 12 by 12 granite tile from Home Depot, set it on my bench up next to the edge, put some wet dry sandpaper down, flip the frog upside down and just work it until I see an even scratch pattern all the way around. So the frog has to be flat, the bottom should be flat within reason, the mouth should be nice and tight and square, and then the rest of it's just mechanics. When I buy or get a plane that's an antique, I'll generally take the whole thing apart. I'll take it all apart, I'll clean all the parts, put it back together, and when I put it back together, anything that's got threads on it, I'll put a drop of oil on it. And usually it's 3-in-1, lightweight machine oil. Just you want to make sure that all the knobs and all the screws work. I've had some occasions where this blade lever cap screw was frozen, so I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So I'll put a drop of oil on that before I thread it back in, just to keep things working. Now, while I've got this out, the blade out, I want to talk a little bit about the mouth opening. On a smoothing plane in particular, you want the cutting edge to be relatively close to the front of the mouth. You want a tight mouth opening, and I'm talking maybe a 32nd. So on these old style planes, the only way to adjust that is to move the frog forward, and to do that, you can't really see it from where you are, but there are screw mechanisms in the back that allow you to adjust that frog position forward or back to keep that mouth opening tight. So you want to, for the thickness of shaving you want the mouth opening be just a little bit wider than that, obviously. It's common to have a cracked tote on used planes or broken totes. You can find them online, or you can make your own. If you've got another plane around that's got a complete tote on it, trace it. And there are, I mean, even Lee Valley, I believe, has plans on how to make your own tote for Stanley planes. They tell you how to drill it for the threaded rod, you know, all that. So don't let that dissuade you. Even if it's completely missing the tote, you can get a replacement. All right, the lateral adjustment lever, you want to make sure moves freely. So sometimes just a little oil is all it needs. Sometimes they're bent, so do what you can to bend it without breaking it off. It's held in place with a rivet. So anyway, that's the basic base of the plane. And then we come to the iron and the chip breaker. And these work in tandem to create the smoothest shaving without tear out and without chattering. Everybody understand what I mean by chattering? As you push a blade, if it's not sharp, if it's not adjusted properly, sometimes as you're pushing the plane, it actually skips across the wood and you'll see little ripples. And that was one experience I had with my dad's hand plane in his basement shop, is I couldn't get the thing to cut. So let's talk a little bit about blades. When you buy, especially an old style plane, there was a period of time there when they used really thin metal for their blades. And I'm going to tell you, if that's the case, buy a new blade. And I've given you some resources at the back of your handout where you can purchase new blades. This one happens to be a Hock blade. It's, I forget, it's like an 1/8 inch thick. Quality blade makes all the difference in the world. So the first thing I usually do is I usually set the blade aside if it's got an old style blade in it. And I should back up here a little bit and say, when I purchase hand planes, I purchase them to use them. I'm not a collector. There are guys out there that can tell you the year, month, and day this particular plane was made, by what type of knob it has, you know, all that stuff. I don't care as long as it works. So for my kids and my grandkids, I've taken all the parts that I've taken off these planes and I've put them in a box so that if some collector gets them someday, he could put it back together the way it was originally meant to be. But I'm going to make it useful for my purposes. And that usually means purchasing a new blade. While I'm talking about irons or blades, let's talk about tool steel. Traditionally, 01 tool steel was the choice. Easy to sharpen, easy to hone, and for years that was my preference. And then along came this craze for cryogenically treated A2 tool steel. And I've got a couple irons, I may even have one here somewhere, that is an A2 blade. I had a long conversation with Ron Hock while I was at the Woodsmith Magazine. I was writing an article about the different types of steel. If you ever get a chance to talk to Ron Hock, the guy is an encyclopedia of knowledge. I mean, we talked for 45 minutes about plane irons and steel. And his take is, because of the crystal structure of A2 steel, you will never get it as sharp as O1 tool steel. The advantage it brings to the table is it holds the edge longer than O1 tool steel. For me, I prefer a sharper edge than I do a longer lasting edge, because I don't mind taking the blade out and honing it to get my edge back. If you don't like sharpening, then maybe consider A2 tool steel, but just bear in mind that you'll never get it as sharp as the O1 steel. A few years back, Lee Valley upped the ante a little bit with, Veritas did, with powdered metal steel, PMV11, and they offer it now as an option on most all of their hand planes. I love those blades. I would give all my O1 steel and A2 steel blades over for PMV11. I think the edge lasts longer, I can get it sharp, and it seems to last forever. So if you're considering at least well, I think they even sell PMV11 blades for the older style Stanley planes. So if you're, and you know, you pay a little extra for them, but to me they're worth it, just in my experience using them. So an investment in a good blade, you're talking 30, 35, 40 bucks. And you probably, if you picked one of these up at a yard sale, you probably, if you paid more than 10 or 15 or 20, you might have been paying too much. So invest in a good blade. Most of those blade manufacturers also sell replacement chip breakers. Can anybody tell me what the purpose of this guy is, the chip breaker? It is exactly what it says. It actually helps curl that shaving up to help it break cleanly. Now, there's some argument about whether you really need one or not, but my argument for it is that it also helps support the cutting edge. It adds mass to that cutting edge. When I set my chip breaker, I'm setting it right next to that cutting edge. I'm back maybe a 64th of an inch. So when I tighten that chip breaker down, that very tip of that blade has got some beef behind it to help prevent chattering. And you're going to get a lot smoother results that way. So when you purchase an old hand plane, check that the chip breaker is flat. I purchased one time, sharpened the blade, got that thing razor sharp. I was shaving end grain off of pine. It was that sharp. Which is a good test, by the way, for sharpness. However, when I put the chip breaker back on, reinstalled it in the plane, took a few shavings, it just wasn't working. So I took it back out and I looked at it. The chip iron chip breaker was twisted. So I didn't have a tight connection here between the chip breaker and the cutting edge. I looked in between and I had chips jammed up in between them. So you want to make sure that it's tight against the cutting edge all the way across. The other thing is you want to make sure that that chip breaker is sharp at the point where it contacts the blade. A lot of these old style planes have a rounded end on the chip breaker, and that kind of tends to catch the chips as you're planing. So I've been known to take it off, take the chip breaker off, go to my diamond stone or water stone or whatever your preference is, hang it over the edge of the bench, and get that that top edge, that leading edge, nice and sharp. Doesn't have to cut wood, but it needs to be sharp enough that it's not going to catch shavings as they come out of the plane. The replacement chip breakers that you can buy from Hock Tools and Lee Valley are actually as thick as actually I have one here, as thick as the blades themselves. This is a Hock chip iron or chip breaker and blade, and they actually sharpen it like a blade, but they relieve the back side so that as you clamp it down, it puts a point of contact right at that cutting edge. I prefer this because it adds more mass to the cutting edge, and mass equals less vibration. So that's a good investment to make also, and you'll probably pay 15, 20 bucks for the chip breaker as well. So, you know, realistically, you invest 60, 75 bucks in a blade and a chip breaker, you've got a plane that'll last you for generations. I mean, it'll go on forever. So as I reassemble it, I'm going to make sure that the chip breaker's on the back side of the blade, not the bevel side. Swing it around, and when you install the chip breaker, make sure you're far enough back so that when you swing it around, you're not scoring the cutting edge. So then I'll slide it up until I'm about, I don't know, 1/32 of an inch back from the cutting edge. And I'm trying to make sure it's even all the way across. Handy tool to have, by the way. This is sold by Lee Valley. It's just for this purpose, tightening the chip breaker screw. But you can use a regular screwdriver. So we've got the body nice and flat. We've checked the frog, make sure it's flat. We've got our blade nice and sharp. We could have 2 more presentations on sharpening. So I'm not going to really touch on that tonight. Just use whatever method you feel comfortable with. I will say that on a smoothing plane, like the number 3, the number 4.5, the number 4s, typically when you sharpen, you want to create just the slightest little camber on the blade. So if this is the cutting edge of the blade, you want to create just the slightest little camber, and that's, you guys can't see that. But anyway, just, I'm talking a few thousandths of an inch is all, from this corner to the high point of that cambered edge. And what that does is it allows you to take a full width shaving without creating what we call plane tracks, where the corner of the plane iron digs into the wood and leaves tracks. Yes, sir?
You do it on both sides?
To both sides. And when I sharpen, it's just a matter of, I sharpen by hand. I don't like using a jig, but I know a lot of guys don't feel comfortable sharpening by hand. But all it involves, whether you use a jig or not, is as you're sharpening, you're just putting a little pressure on one side for maybe 10 strokes, and a little pressure on the opposite side for maybe 10 strokes, and that is it. I made the mistake when I first got one of these of trying to do that, and I put such a camber in, and all I ever got was the shaving this wide because it was so steep. But that's another topic for another day. Any questions on taking a plane and tuning it up? Yes, sir.
I know Stanley had a couple of different styles. He had the Bailey, whatever the other one is, and Veritas has a different gizmo. I can't remember what they call it. And I think these things just tell you how to move the frog or the blade forward and backward. But are there any inherent advantages to any of the systems? You prefer one over the other? Does it matter? Do you have any idea what I'm talking about?
Yes. No, I think I do. Traditional Bailey planes have a blade depth adjustment knob back here. So on most planes, as you turn the knob clockwise, the blade makes a deeper shaving. Veritas uses what's called a NORRIS, N-O-R-R-I-S style adjuster, and it combines the lateral adjustment with, the whole thing came out, with the depth adjustment. So the way this works, I'll just take it out so you can see, there's a pivot point that fits into a boss in the frog of the plane, and then there's another boss that fits into the chip breaker. So as you tighten or loosen this screw, it moves the blade in or out. But because of this pivot point, as I move it left or right, it adjusts the lateral position or the angle of the blade. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, is there inherent, I mean, is one better than the other? Does it matter?
I prefer the NORRIS style adjustment. Some guys don't like it because it's kind of touchy. If you happen to bump it, then you throw out your lateral adjustment. You're no longer square or parallel to the sole of the plane. I don't have that big a deal with it. But to me, I've got finer control of the blade depth with this, and it just feels better to me. With some of these older planes, I have, with everybody familiar with what backlash is in a thread? As you turn a knob, it doesn't really engage until you turn it a couple times. That's the problem you might run into with these older style planes. I could turn the knob maybe 3/4 to a turn and a half before it actually catches to advance the blade. Likewise, when you retract it. And that's something to point out. If you're using one of these older style knobs, they tell you to advance it until you feel it catch. And even if you retract the blade because you want to take a thinner shaving, they tell you to spin it back down until you feel it catch so that there's no play in the threads that'll mess with your depth. So I prefer the NORRIS style adjustment just because it just feels better to me and I get finer control. Yes, sir. The question is, you've got all these different sizes of hand planes and they all seem to do the same basic job. They shave wood and they all basically smooth wood. The differences come in particular, if you're taking rough stock down to a finished dimension, then you're going to start with, and we're going to talk about this in a second, we're going to, let's back up a little bit. I don't own a power joiner in my shop. I could never afford one. I don't have the space for one, particularly now. So I did one of two things. I used a rip blade in my table saw and got the smoothest edge I could, and then I sanded it, or I took a smoothing plane to it. Or if I've got a rough piece of stock, now what I do is I'll take my number 7 or number 8, which is 2 feet long. It's a monster. But its purpose is for joining wood. And the reason is it spans a greater distance. It takes off the high points. So once I get the edge smooth, then I'll come back maybe with a smoothing plane, take just a real thin shaving just to get that final touch. And that's another thing too. When I cut my workpieces to size, whether I'm using hand tools or power tools, I'll leave the pencil line so that I can come back with a hand plane and just get that sucker down right where I want it.
Well, your concept of using it as a joiner plane because it's covered a larger area.
Right.
It's the same concept I'm saying, just I'm doing a wider area.
And that exactly, that works. The joiner plane also works if you have to smooth this bench top, for example. Yeah. If it's out of flat, you want to use a longer plane to get it flat initially, but to get that final finish, once it's flat, then you go down to a smaller smoothing plane. Okay. Any other questions on that? Yes, sir. Can you purchase a thicker iron as an upgrade to your hand plane? And the answer is definitely. Most of the newer replacement irons that I listed on the handout are pretty thick. Matter of fact, I had, I think it was this guy here. I put the Hock CHIPBREAKER, which is really thick. It looks, I can't even guess. It's actually thicker than the blade, but it's got a Hock blade in it. I had to actually file the mouth a little wider just to give it clearance. That made me nervous. That made me nervous because I know that edge has to be perfect. So I just stuck a little file in there and did draw strokes on it until it was just wide enough to clear the shavings. All right, a whole other category are low angle planes. Remember I said that these are bevel down? A low angle plane is bevel up. And typically they do not, well, they do not ever have a chip breaker because the bevel is up, there's no place for the chip breaker. So why do I need a low angle plane? End grain. You can shave end grain with a smoothing plane, a typical standard bench plane. As a matter of fact, I saw Phil Lowe did a class in Des Moines while I was with the magazine. And I forget if it was a number 3 or number 4, but he used that sucker for everything. That's the only plane he had, and he was building pie crust tables, you know. And when I saw him shaving end grain, I thought, that guy knows how to sharpen. But for me, I like to use a low angle. So I had, while I was at the magazine, I wrote an article on low angle planes, and I had Veritas, they had a factory second laying around, and I asked them if they could grind the side off so that you could see how low an angle it really is. A typical angle on a standard bench plane is about 45 degrees. That's the angle the bed is bladed at, or blade is bedded at. Low angle planes are typically about a 12-degree bed. Now, the advantage to this is you can change the angle of attack at the cutting edge by changing the angle of the blade. Veritas, Lee Valley, and I think Lee Nielsen, for their low angle planes, they have a series of different blades you can purchase at different bevel angles. So I could essentially turn this low angle plane into acting like a standard bench plane by putting a higher bevel angle blade in it. But for what I use these for is mostly end grain, and I like that low bevel angle so that it slices through the end grain. So this particular size is a, I think they call this the smoother.
Yeah.
And they actually make a smaller one than this. One of the things I always bugged Lee Valley about Veritas was, why don't you guys have a number 3 size hand plane? It's like this. And one of the articles in there talks about why I like a number 3 hand plane. And their argument was, well, you can take our standard block plane and put a tote and a knob on it. And they sell these as accessories. Again, because it's a low angle plane, I've got the 3 different blades at the different angles, so I can put a low angle blade in there for end grain. I've got a high angle blade in here now, so it acts more like a smoothing plane. So there is an argument that if you're going to invest in a plane, maybe a low angle plane is a good investment for you if you're willing to change out the blades to do the different jobs. For me, well, I have an addiction to hand planes to begin with, but typically I like to be able to grab a plane off the shelf and know that it's already set up to shave end grain or to do smoothing or whatever it is I expect it to do. But I want to talk a little bit now, we're actually going to use them. So how do you use a hand plane? This particular plane is a number 3, and I was talking to the shop craftsman at Woodsmith one time. He'd been there like 25 years. The guy did amazing work. He's the one that built a lot of the projects for the magazine. And I was talking to him one day about hand planes. I said, you know, I find myself grabbing my number 3 the most often. And he goes, yeah, me too. He says, it's kind of like a block plane with 2 handles. And to me, it's just for the type of work that I do, I'm typically doing furniture pieces. I'm not doing, you know, large work pieces and tabletops and stuff like that on a typical basis. But for most of the work I do, a number 3 is a good size. So, you know, consider that if you're looking to purchase your first hand plane. All right, so I've got my blade sharp, chip breakers in, all set, everything's ready to go. What I want to do is make sure that, first of all, my blade is projecting from the sole of the plane, so I'm just sighting down the front. And you can use your hand very carefully from the back to the front. to take the sawdust off, and now I'm looking down and I'm actually seeing a line where the blade projects. In this case, I'm a little high on this side, so I'm going to move my lateral adjustment. The lateral adjustment always goes to the direction of the high point. So I'm going to pull it to that direction, and it's going to bring the blade back square to the sole. So just always remember that, whether it's a NORRIS style adjustment or a traditional lateral adjustment, it always goes to the high side. The plane I'm holding, which is a Veritas number 5 1/4, looks like it has 2 mouths. And that is because of the different frog adjustment mechanism it has. It has 2 knobs back here, one to loosen the frog and then one to adjust it forward or back. So this whole assembly moves forward or back to close up the mouth. Now, since you brought that up, on the Veritas low angle planes and even some of the Stanley models, the whole front sole is adjustable. So you just loosen a knob, get the mouth opening you want, and tighten it back down. Pretty cool feature. So I've got my blade depth adjusted, but I can kind of see the blade sticking out from the bottom, but I really don't know how deep a shaving it's going to take. So my technique is to put it on the workpiece and check it. Well, I'm kind of sort of starting to get some shavings. So I just advance. I'm only making maybe 1/8 of a turn on my depth adjustment. And I'm using the longest plane I have here because this is rough sawn. So I want to basically joint this edge. So you can hear it as I'm going along. It's actually skipping along, missing the low spots. And I'm taking a fairly thick shaving. So notice my body position. I've got my left foot planted. I'm starting back here at the end. I've got my hand on the knob. The mistake a lot of guys make when they're hand planing is they want to push down on the plane. You don't need to do that. If your plane is sharp and it's tuned up, all you need to do is push it. So I'm just kind of following it through the stroke, and I've already got this edge pretty much down. Ready to go, glass smooth. So that's how you join an edge. If I had my number 6 or number 7 here, it's just a little bit longer, I might have used it on this just to make sure I got a nice straight edge, but I think my 5 1/4 is plenty long enough to do the job. A tip I learned, it's a tin can with tightly wound cotton t-shirt material. I took one of my son's old t-shirts and cut it into strips and folded it, and you got to really, really pack it in there. And then I soaked it with 3-in-1 oil. So what you do, you have that sitting on the bench, lubricate the bottom of the plane, and you would not believe the difference it makes. Now, the question that I had, doesn't this ruin the finish? The answer is you're planing it off. So there's no oil left. And you're only putting on a really, really thin coat. So this is a can from Green Chilies if you're shopping at Publix. And then Blue Diamond almond can makes a nice lid. But anyway, I thought that was a cool tip. Another tip I've used before I got onto this was just a piece of paraffin or an old candle. Just, make some squiggly lines down the sole of the plane. First time I did this, I about lost the plane off the end of the board. I'm not kidding. Makes a huge difference. Again, you're planing the wax off, so it doesn't affect the finish. But these are really good practical tips. What's the problem with planing end grain? You have to back up where the plane blade exits the cut. Otherwise, it's going to chip out and tear out, and then you're going to swear. So I just glued up this frame this afternoon. I purposely left the style's a little proud. And you may want to consider doing that anyway when you do glue ups for face frames and doors, just so that you can plane them flush. Now, another trick for planing end grain, some denatured alcohol or mineral spirits, whatever you have on hand, and moisten the end grain. Make sure it's good and soaked. And I'm going to use a low angle because that's what it's good at. Just like that, it's flush. And it cuts really, really nice, especially if it's wet. Mineral spirits or denatured alcohol evaporate quickly, so it's not going to affect any finish or anything like that. Now, I get this comment every single time I talk about hand planes. I'm kind of going off the side here a little bit. You notice when I set my planes down, I'm setting them down like this. I had some guy get on my case something fierce. You're not supposed to do that. You have to lay them down like this so that they don't damage the blade. First of all, my argument is I want to be able to reach over and grab my plane and go to work. Second thing is I actually tried this on during a project one time, and I went to reach for something and came across the blade. I'll never do it again. So for me, it's as simple as looking at the bench, making sure there's no metal, anything on the bench that can harm the blade, and set your plane down. The other thing you'll notice I did up here is that you just find a scrap piece of thin strip of wood, and you can just set the toe of the plane on it if it concerns you, so that the blade's elevated off the bench. It's not rocket science. So that's basically planing end grain, except that, what if, I've got a situation here where when I glued this up, can we see what's going on there? The style is a little bit, actually the rail's a little bit proud this time. So how am I going to fix that? Well, if I come at it and get the rail flush, the chances are that I may blow out this back edge as I'm coming across it. So there are two ways around that problem to avoid blowout on the back side, and one is to put another workpiece right up against it to back it up. Another one is to just come at it from the other side, just plane in this direction until you get almost to the edge, then come back and hit that end grain. Likewise, this I purposely glued this up, which is interesting. I didn't use any screws. I was going to use pocket screws, but I just used Tight Bond, and it's not coming apart, and it's end grain. So I think we undervalue the strength of our wood glues sometimes. Well, that's the other thing I was going to mention. You have to have a solid bench, and the other problem you have is how you're going to clamp the workpiece so that you can plane where you need to plane without anything getting in the way. Bench dogs are great for that. If you have dog holes in your bench, clamp it between the dogs. Just make sure that the dogs are below the surface. The question comes up, how do you plane around a corner? Let's find a good one here. I'm a little high over here. So I don't know, it just depends. Sometimes I'll just start at the high spot and work diagonally across the joint. Like I said, clamping is paramount. So I've already got that flush, then I could just work my way around. Now you've got a flush face frame. I use block planes This is a little apron plane. It actually comes with you can get a leather holster for it that you can put on your belt or put in your shop apron. I use block planes a lot for putting a chamfer on the edge of a workpiece. Creates a nice visual detail. And even if I don't need a complete chamfer, you know, when you build a project and you give it to somebody, what's one of the first things they do? They run their hand over it. So you don't want any sharp edges. You know, you want it to be tactile friendly. So just take a block plane and just knock off the sharp corners. Just takes 2 or 3 strokes and you could feel a difference. To avoid blowout on the backside, you can chamfer the backside if that end doesn't really matter. If it's going to be hidden somewhere, you can just chamfer it. Just like that. Then come at it and shave that end grain off. 2 accessories you may want to consider for hand plane use. This is not my design. This came from one of the fine woodworking videos, I think. This is a shooting board, and its specialty is squaring the end grain of a workpiece. So this particular one, I just took a carpenter's speed square plastic one and made a fence for it at a 45-degree angle. The fence of the square rides in a groove, like so, so I can shoot the ends of a miter, which is the best way you will ever find to fine-tune the fit of a miter joint. Guaranteed. You get a glass smooth finish, and you can work your way around the frame and end up with perfect corners every time. Absolute best. So the basic shooting board, this one I hacked together from scraps. I'll probably build a better one at some point. It's got a base that the plane rides in on its side. It's got a piece of the bed is actually here that the workpiece sits on. It's got a fence that I know is square to this edge, and it's held in place with a couple screws and oversized holes so that when it gets out of adjustment, which it will, I can tweak it back to square. It's got a cleat on the back side to engage the edge of my workbench or clamp in my face vise. So you just basically put the plane up against the bed, shove the workpiece into the sole of the plane, and start shaving the end grain. I don't have to be concerned about blowout on the backside because my fence is keeping that in place. So now I've got a glass smooth surface and I know that this is square. It's that quick, and you know, I know my joint's going to go together perfectly square. To use the miter, I put the fence back in. It just so happens I have a miter cut on here. It's the way it came out. So you just put the miter, same principle, put the miter up against the sole of the plane. Maybe cutting a little deep, but you get the idea. So you can come up afterwards and feel that glass smooth. Being a glass smooth surface is going to make for a great glue joint. You can actually buy specialty shooting planes. What's nice about them is they have a right angle bed, and the blade is angled so that it makes a shearing cut across the end grain instead of coming at it straight across. And it has a cocked handle on it so that you can use it without this awkward hand position.
Is a low angle plane better suited for that?
I would say so, yes. I mean, I know Andrew uses a low angle plane. That's what I typically use on end grain. All right, I feel like I missed a lot of stuff, but we're out of time, so I want to open it up for questions if anybody has any. If you want to come up and take a look at these, I'll answer any questions if I can. Thank you. Appreciate it.